Albanian sort of ethnic community in Kosovo feel oppressed by and have been rather harshly treated by the Serbian government under Mr. Milosevic. On the other hand, Serbs feel that one must understand this conflict in its broader historical, the dreaded H word, historical context, that it goes back away, and that it includes concerns back to the Second World War, for instance, in which large numbers of Serbs were removed from the Kosovo region by invading German forces, who instead tended to substitute Albanians, Albania having sided with Germany more effectively than Serbia, which was resisting the Nazis. And for that, they suffered. And so there is that memory. Memories go back a long ways. They can go back to the First World War, in which the Yugoslav Federation was originally set up as a way of dealing with the lands taken from the losing side in the First World War, the Turkish Empire, called the Ottomans, and the Austrian Empire, both losers. So very often, as in the case of many losses of wars, the spoils get split. And in this case, you had an added dimension with President Woodrow Wilson of the United States articulating an idea which has become an important idea in world affairs, and the idea is the notion of self-determination. That is, ethnic groups, national groups should have the right to determine their own fate, or their own government, so to speak. Now, we know that that's imperfect. It doesn't apply to everybody. It hasn't been applied to everybody. Wilson didn't even mean it to apply to everybody. But it was taken up, and it was internalized and believed by many, many groups in many parts of the world, including this part of the world in the Balkans. And as we know, the war in World War I started really in the Balkans, in what is now Bosnia, Sarajevo, where the first assassination took place and led to, by the way, interestingly, led to an ultimatum against Serbia. Those of you history buffs. So that the last time there was an ultimatum to Serbia, for better or worse, it resulted in a world war. I hope that this time, since there has been an ultimatum to Serbia, really amounts to an ultimatum to Serbia, what was done at the Paris peace talks, which failed before the bombing took place, was a plan proposed by the United States and NATO, proposed to the two sides in Kosovo, as the Albanians would call it, to allow for an international force to sort of come in and patrol the country, to allow for an interim period of 3 years to determine its future, a vote by the people, and so forth. That plan, that proposal was seen as fair in Washington. After all, it would have disarmed the rebels, the Kosovo rebels, the KLA, and the Albanian forces that had been marshaled against the Serbs. And that was a major objective of the Serbs. And after all, it would have guaranteed security for the Albanians, which is a major issue for them. So it looked fair to us. But the perspective in Washington is not the same necessarily as the perspective on the spot. And for the Serbs, they had felt that they had no role in writing that proposal. They felt that they had no part in it. It wasn't negotiation to them, it was dictation. So they refused to sign. The Kosovo side did sign. So you ended up with a non-agreement in Rambouillet, which led the Americans to be very angry, I think, about it, and to try to punish Mr. Milosevic for his obstinance. So that is, in a nutshell, some of the history around where we've gotten to. The history actually goes back hundreds and even 1,000 years, in some people's minds, to when the Turks first encountered the Christians in Southern Europe and occupied territory, which the Serbs, many Serbs, remember as a blow to their nationhood. And in a way, the confrontations between Muslims and Christians grew from that, but I don't consider this basically a religious conflict. I consider it basically a conflict of national identity. Interesting, because in many cases they share a culture. They certainly share language in many parts of this region. Albanians have a distinct language, but certainly Serbs and Croats and others speak pretty much the same language. So you can't pin it to language. You can sort of pin it on religion, but not quite. It involves identity. And that's perhaps the most complicated thing we know about psychologically for humans, is their identity. Interestingly, we learned about that in Colorado, that even teenagers have different identities about in-group and out-group, we and they. And that's very strong stuff, very psychologically strong. And it often relates to hurt, it often relates to frustration, and in this case, in the Balkans, also to economic conditions. Because when the economy tends to be good, people sort of get along better. After all, you got to do business. There's business to be done. But when the economy goes bad, as it did in Yugoslavia in the 1980s, remember the car, the Yugo? Some of you are too young to remember the Yugo. That was one of Yugoslavia's great exports, hopeful exports. The little car, modeled, I think, on a Fiat. It wasn't very good, and it didn't sell, and where it did sell, it sort of fell apart, literally. Well, that symbolized the Yugoslav economy, which had taken a move toward modernization, but it didn't quite work. And when thousands are thrown out of work, when young people aged 18 to 25 don't have a perspective on life, that they can succeed, that there's something for them to do, that there's a purpose, they become easier prey to demagogues who like to blame it on others. And the relationship in a tense place like Kosovo, a small place, 90% Albanian, 10% Serbian, which had had a history of autonomy in the Yugoslav Federation. You see that one of the interesting things that was done after the Second World War was that Marshal Tito, who you may know as having been the ruler of Yugoslavia, leader who had rather successfully resisted the Germans and was a communist. Tended to be the most forceful resistors. But anti-Soviet, interestingly enough. Anyway, he decided that things had to be frozen, pretty much frozen, in order to prevent renewal of ancient conflicts. And so he allowed the situation in Kosovo to remain status quo and gave the province autonomy, that is, local self-rule, so that there would be a reduction of tension. That worked as long as Tito lived. His strong hand, his dictatorial rule made it pretty much, for better or worse, stabilized. When he died, and when the economy went south, so to speak, and when the Cold War came to an end, with the respective interests of the United States and the Soviet Union in that area sort of diminishing, things were freer to bubble up to the surface and to get hot again and to get contentious. And finally, opportunistic politicians like Mr. Milosevic saw a gain for themselves in getting behind popular discontent and channeling it into a mass movement to prevent the further disintegration of Yugoslavia. Because one of the things that happened, and from Milosevic's point of view, is that Yugoslavia was being torn apart. Several parts of the former Yugoslavia were allowed to become independent, with the actual encouragement early on by, for instance, the Germans and others in Western Europe. So that Croatia left, Slovenia left, tended to be countries that were more Catholic, more related to Europe, to the center of Europe, less identified with the East than the Serbs had been. So this was very much resented by in Belgrade, and they moved to very forcefully ruthlessly prevent the loss of any further territory. And that's one of the reasons for what happened in Bosnia and the vicious fighting that took place there. And it's one of the reasons for the sensitivity about loss of Kosovo, which is even further at the heart of Serb national pride, historically. So Mr. Milosevic, an opportunistic politician, is able to take advantage of that kind of thing, that kind of popular discontent and also resentment of outsiders. I want to open to a broad discussion today, but first I want to lay out three basic forces that are at work that complicate foreign policy to deal with this. Okay, three basic forces at work. Principles, three basic ideas that you have to keep in mind. Principle number one, international relations is organized by what we call the sovereign state system. Anybody know what that means? The sovereign state system. It originated, it's a 17th century concept that we're still living with. It started out in the 17th century. And it premised on the notion of sovereignty. Anybody quickly tell me what sovereignty is? Yes. Right, well, it comes out in a way out of self-determination. What's the next step after you've determined yourself? You can rule yourself, and you shouldn't have outside interference in doing that. That was set up as a system of law. It's the basis on which we organize all of world politics, and have since the 17th century. Why is it, by the way, that they do that? Why did we all decide that that's okay to have, you over there take care of your affairs, we'll take care of our affairs, and we won't interfere with each other? What's the reason for that? Anybody? Well, actually, it was thought that it would prevent war. Because if you think about the 17th century, it was a century of almost constant warfare. The 30 Years' War, coming close to the 100 Years' War, and all this stuff among small princedoms, princely domains in Europe. This is a European concept. And it was between Catholics and Protestants. And the only way they could figure to get over this, to get beyond this constant fighting and interfering and trying to overthrow the heretics, is to arrive at a principle: we'll leave you alone, you leave us alone. You go ahead and be Catholic, we'll go ahead and be Protestant. You stay out of our business, we'll stay out of yours. It was decided as a sort of a stabilizing principle. And it grew. It was accepted as international law. And even the countries that came later to independence, in Asia, in Africa, in the Middle East, in North America, adopted this as a pretty good idea. After all, otherwise we'd be tempted to overthrow each other all the time. So that's principle number one, state sovereignty. Principle number two is a 20th century principle, which is a little newer, more up to date. And it's the principle of human rights. It's the principle of human rights. Oddly enough, we're almost on the anniversary of the first meetings that were about this at The Hague in the Netherlands, the Hague Peace Conventions that took place in 1899, which posited that certain behavior by humans to humans is so heinous and so bad that it must be avoided. First, they looked at behavior in war and said you shouldn't bomb cities. Oops, by the way, they said you shouldn't bomb cities. We'll talk about that in a few minutes. They said you should be careful about prisoners of war. Oops, we got some prisoners of war. We still have to watch out if people are being careful about. All kinds of principles about bad behavior. Extended then over the time of the 20th century. And what's the 20th century been? If the 17th century was constant war, my gosh, look at the 20th century. Well, how would you characterize it? Constant police action. For what reason? Why do we need police action? What's the century been like? But why do they need watching? What kind of behavior has been going on that would merit having to be watched? Fighting, but maybe that's true of lots of centuries. War, we've had two big ones, it's true, bigger than anything seen before, but war was seen before. What else have we had that's sort of maybe a little more unusual? Yes. Acts of genocide, what does that mean? Well, we just had a conference at Wayne State. One of your teachers was there, and it was called The 20th Century, the Century of Genocide and Holocaust. Now, maybe that's over dramatized, but we're not just talking about the Holocaust here. I mean, that's pretty vivid in people's minds. But the century started out with a set of circumstances that affected the Armenian people in Turkey, which they, felt, and rightly so, amounted to the slaughter of so many of their people that one begins to lose the population. And it's a genocide. Genocide means killing the nationality. And so we became more concerned, although it was slow. I mean, the amount of concern and the growth rate of concern about this has been slow and uneven. Hitler knew that. He knew he could get away with all of this. But one thing about the 20th century that's made it possible is the mechanization and the technology of killing. So that in 2 weeks you can clear whole areas where it might have taken 2 years or something in the past. And you can do further, you can send them, to become slaves as they did in the Holocaust. And then you can even dispose of them because they're disposable slaves. Because we'd seen slavery in years past, but usually the slaves were kept out. In the Holocaust, the slaves were killed. So we have the ultimate degree, the nth degree of development of all the bad behavior that humans have been accumulating over time. It appears in the 20th century. And that has led us to be concerned about, what do you do? Should you do something? Can you just stand by while people are inhuman to each other? So that's principle number 2. By the way, do you see any conflict between principle number 1 and principle number 2? Mrs. Green is shaking her head yes. What's the conflict? Right, but by the way, they never say it's acts of genocide that they're committing. People always feel that there's a justification for what they're doing. They don't feel that they're, criminals. Often they feel like the people that they're clearing out were there unjustly in the first place, or have been victimizing them in the past. I mean, look at Rwanda. Switch gears a moment to Africa. In Rwanda, there was vicious killing, authorized for months on the radio by the government that said it's okay to kill these people, they're inhuman, they're subhuman. By the way, it helps to be subhuman to be killed. Because if you're human, people don't want to. There's a tendency to be a little bit restrained about killing humans, but every time people have been victimized en masse, they've been subhumanized. So watch for that as an early warning. When you see some people being subhumanized by others, propaganda-wise, watch out. Because it makes it easier then to tolerate killing them, or disposing of them, or moving them, or kicking them out, or whatever. And in Rwanda, they did this, but the group that was doing the killing, the Hutu, had themselves been victimized in the past. Yes, they had. There had been massacres by Tutsis of Hutus in the past. And they could all hark back to that, and think about it. And fear and economic competition, and all these factors come in to raise the willingness of people to do insane things. Insane things that they would not do ordinarily. But out of fear, anger, frustration, people will do strange things. So the sense was in the 20th century you have to do something about it. But yes, you're right. The notion is, you know, the international community has some responsibility to do something. Outsiders have a responsibility not to just be bystanders. But there is that also that principle of sovereignty, which is important because it's the basis on which we all have agreed to get along. So can you just go in and invade them in order to save those people? And that's really what we're wrestling with as NATO evolves its mission to try to do something along these lines. Third principle, before we open it up on the floor here completely, third principle of concern has to do with the international relations. Just as the parties inside Kosovo or inside Serbia see things from their own perspectives, the parties around them in the neighborhood also see things in their perspectives. NATO's action has been billed in this country as humanitarian. We are, taking it as part of that international law that's developed in the 20th century for human rights, that there's a humanitarian responsibility to intervene and save people who are being victimized. How does that look to others who are not in NATO? Let's say, how does it look to, I'll just pick Russia, for example. How does it look to Russia that NATO is saying we should go into Yugoslavia and rescue people and have humanitarian relief? Anybody? Yes.
Interfering with the internal relations of another country.
Okay, yes, there's an argument of interfering with internal relations of another country. Just any other country? Okay, well, yes. We have to review, again, the H word, history. Russia has had a traditional, long-standing relationship with Serbia. Anybody know why? Yes, sir. Sort of. The Orthodox Church, yes. What else? Slavic people, what does that mean? Okay, it gets a little vague, you're right. Background is a good word, culture is another word, but actually it's language. They don't speak the same language, Russian and Serbo-Croatian, but it's related, strongly related language group. Now, by the way, the Poles are also in that group, the Czechs are in that group, others are in that group. Interestingly, they're in NATO at the moment. So it doesn't preclude changing sides or redefining your interests. Poles have a little different religion, so do the Czechs, so maybe that helps change sides. But the Russians and the Serbs have sort of stuck together, and this goes back all the way to the First World War, when Serbia received that ultimatum from Austria and backed by Germany, who came to their rescue? Russia. For better or worse. I mean, you could think of better people to rescue you because the Russians weren't in such good shape to rescue anybody at that time, but they tried. And you had World War I. Now, NATO, you see, doesn't come without its baggage. After all, what is NATO? What's NATO been for 50 years? It's been an alliance against who? Soviet Union, Russia, however you want to put it, the East. And who's in NATO that the Russians or the East might find a little bit of concern? Germany, among others, is in NATO. And the Russians have long memories about what the Germans did in Europe, and so do the Serbs. So when we come to free people, to spread democracy, and Bill Clinton, I can't do him justice, but he could get up and spellbind us with how this is all going to be, bringing liberation. We bring baggage in the eyes of those in the old world who've seen other things and don't trust it. Because what have we told the Russians? We've told the Russians, hey, don't worry, guys. Don't worry. NATO is defensive. It's not meant to be a threat. It's not meant against you guys. In fact, we'll make you partners. You can come to the summit and cheer us as we celebrate our 50th anniversary. So don't worry about a thing. But as the Russians are fond of saying, and as President Reagan used to quote them, trust but verify. What have the actions of the United States shown about that to the Russians? Russians objected to us bombing, but what did we do? We went ahead and did it. The Russians felt that there shouldn't be a very strong pressure on Serbia, that the negotiations would be better, but we went ahead and put the pressure on. And who is it that we first end up fighting? NATO's first unified war. Gee, Russian ally, Russian friends, and not allies actually, sort of Russian cousins. It's a lesson or a signal not lost in Moscow, where public opinion, by the way, we are told, has been very much shifted in this case, away from a hope that the West can be, a strong economic partner, an investment, source of investment in Russia, to a real sense that the West may be trying to outmaneuver the Russians and, in the game of chess, move our pieces very much further east. Russians are good chess players, as we know. Yes, did you want to?
Question. Given the horrible state of the Russian economy and the fact that they're so dependent on continued Western financial resources, and the fact that they defaulted and so on in August, the perception I've seen is that although the Russians will make lots of noise, they need us so badly that they're not going to push this too far. Being the ally and eastern cousins of the Serbs. What is your view of that?
Well, so what they really want to do is try to moderate and broker and mediate an agreement, because they can see. Right. Right.
Serbia.
Well, these are all very compelling points about the Russians. They may object to it, and they may be opposed to it, but this is why the Americans, in a way, are treating them like this, because 15 years ago, folks, we wouldn't be doing this. 15 years ago, we would not be undertaking a NATO bombing mission in Yugoslavia, because it would have been viewed as too threatening to the potential stability of nuclear relationships. But Russia is weakened, and Russia is dependent, and Russia is not in a position really to fight World War III, we think. And Mr. Yeltsin may yell rather loudly, but his actions are really rather moderate. What have they done actually? They've sent one ship to observe. They've obeyed the arms embargo of Yugoslavia. They're sending oil, which, by the way, may be a point of conflict, because we've avowed that we would blockade the oil going to Yugoslavia very soon, which means that we may have to start boarding Russian ships to do that. So that could be tense. But anyway, so the Russians, what do they do about it? They don't really do very much about it. But note, there's another concern. Do we want a stable Russia under moderate, sort of proto-democratic leadership, however weird it is? Think about Mr. Yeltsin. Or do we risk such a backlash of anti-Americanism in Russia that coming to power in the future, in your lifetimes, will be a very rough, tough, harsh nationalist government in Russia, which will only conclude that one must rearm to make the Americans take us seriously. I mean, what's the lesson? When you're weak, do they listen to you? When you're weak, they treat you like you're a beggar. Okay, the IMF can come and give you some loans, and you come and worship at the feet of NATO, and everything's okay. From the Russian perspective, the lesson learned, and everybody learns lessons from the H word, from history, better or worse, accurate or not. Their lesson here will be, they only pay attention to you when you're heavily armed, and those missiles are targeted at Detroit. I think that's a lesson we would perhaps not like to have learned, but that is potentially what happens. There's another concern about what we've been doing, I must say, before we open the floor, that is that we have been doing something we want to say is preventing destabilization of the region. We're trying to head off ethnic cleansing, and that's a noble thing to do. And we're trying to, trying to prevent this kind of thing from happening in other parts of the region in Europe. But in the process, 800,000 refugees have left their homeland and have put pressure on, settled into some of the most unstable, poor, and tottering countries in the region. Albania, Macedonia, particularly, some other ones. Now, can these particular governments, with their own ethnic balances, see, everybody's balanced off. Everybody's got some of somebody else's people in their borders, because this place is so diverse. And when they formed up these borders, somewhat arbitrarily sometimes, a result of war or whatever, everybody's got minorities. But when these Albanians come flowing into Macedonia, it upsets the balance of social numbers in Macedonia. So who cares? So what's the big deal, Macedonia? Well, who does care about Macedonia, by the way? Sorry? Macedonians, yes, they care. Who else cares? Are you Macedonian? The Greeks have certain interests and concerns about the fate of Macedonia, which, by the way, they don't even recognize as a country in some respects. And we know that in the late 40s, after the war, there was all kinds of concerns. Where will the borders be drawn? Who's going to be taken into Greece? Where will Albania be? And all this kind of stuff. These countries are rather tenuously formed. And we have unleashed a set of social forces now with the movements of populations, which have effects on the ground and real effects in now people's lives in many of these places. So have we calculated that? I don't know. Are we able to control it? I don't know. I would hope that President Clinton knows, or Madeleine Albright, but I don't think they know either. So principles. They compete. They raise questions for both regional and international stability. And they leave us rubbing and scratching our heads as to what we should be doing. And I'm going to want to end on what we should be doing or could be doing, but I want to ask you first of any questions and comments that you've accumulated over this morning when you've been listening to all these presentations. Anybody have any questions? Or anything you'd like to say about concerns? Yes.
How many ground troops will it take until they consider that ground troops are actually in there? Because I keep saying that, I thought there aren't any ground troops, and people are like, oh yeah, well there's 100,000, no big deal. How many is?
Well, I think my understanding is it's a couple of tens of thousands that are accumulating in Macedonia and now in Albania. Ground troops, American, you mean NATO ground troops?
Yeah,
what you
NATO
mean?
ground.
No, see, at the moment they're standing by, presumably to deter any attacks on those countries by the Serbs. I'm not sure why they would really want to do that, but if they're hurting enough internally, they may want to spread the war and make it, tougher on the Americans. But they're also, presumably also there to maybe keep peace if internal tensions break out in those countries. We are sort of inheriting Albania as an ally, I'm telling you. I mean, I don't think we've calculated that ahead of time, but I think we're inheriting it de facto. Italy may have wanted it at one point as a colony. The Americans are somewhat responsible, and sometimes we don't take full responsibility for where we go, but we may have to be in Albania for a while.
Yeah. It has to do with NATO forces and predominantly U.S. forces that are scattered all over Europe. So we've got, we have just normal course of business, many tens of thousands of troops in Western Europe.
And the question is, do we need to use them on the ground in Kosovo to solve the conflict with Milosevic? Because he has the temerity not to give in. He's doing a Saddam Hussein on us. We, by the way, I think thought that because we knew how to deal with Saddam, bomb him, it would translate to dealing with Milosevic. He had, after all, been negotiating with us in the past on Bosnia and had pretty much given in when we put pressure on or when we offered inducements. So we thought, I think we knew how to handle him. But there are certain things perhaps beyond which he can't be pushed. And the question then becomes, do you treat him as a war criminal, as some would like, and not deal with him at all and just, bomb or try to capture him, assassinate him? Or do you have to deal with him at some point to figure out when and if the refugees can return, what type of forces will be there in Kosovo to patrol, to protect, for how long, whether Kosovo is to be independent or not independent. The United States has taken a rather strong position. Canada agrees that Kosovo should not be independent. Britain, on the other hand, has issued statements that maybe, we're not sure. In the proposals in Paris, it was not to be independent, but it looked for all the world to Milosevic like it was going to be. So we have to be very clear about what the future of Kosovo is, purportedly going to be: autonomous, semi-autonomous, not independent, independent, this kind of thing. That would have to be part of the bargaining, and be very, very clear to Milosevic that it's not intended to be independent at any point in the future. That's tough to take for the Albanians. And so you do have political pressures on both sides of that issue. Yes?
One of the questions negotiating for all. The assumption being that we tried negotiating in Paris, that has been a debatable point as to whether we were really trying to negotiate or impose on Serbia at that time. But the presumption being then is that the air campaign is designed to force Milosevic into serious negotiations, and that he would back down after a brief air campaign. Obviously, it's not back down. The movement of the Albanians out of Kosovo has been sped up to a much more rapid pace than appears to be anticipated. Then the question next is, well, if the bombing doesn't get him into negotiations, do we get him into negotiations by more bombing, by being more patient? And that is one perspective that seems to be widely discussed, that NATO says we just need to be more patient. And yet there are also forces within Congress, and I guess perhaps to some extent in some places within Europe, they're saying what we need to do is to have a ground campaign. I'm wondering if you would expand on the options that we really face at this point in time, including your comments, the difficulty of trying to stage a ground campaign in Kosovo, given the geography, given the history, given the extreme feelings on the part of the Serbs, the history of the Serbs in fighting, the difficulty of getting troops into the area. I think those might be.
Yeah, there are all kinds of complications along those lines. Here are lessons of actually another historical incident, Vietnam, come to mind. We tried a lot of bombing in Vietnam to get the party to agree to our terms. Didn't work. Their terms were too important to them to just be bombed into submission. We also tried ground troops in Vietnam in a major way. And they encountered guerrillas who were sympathetic to the opposition and a population sympathetic to the opposition. So in a way, it depends on what the Serb population in the countryside, and now it's been cleared pretty much of many opponents, it depends on what that population would think about invading forces and how much resistance in the mountains or whatever they could be put up for how long by the guerrilla or military resistance. I don't know how well trained the Yugoslav army is in guerrilla tactics, but I assume that they know some. They used them very well against the Germans in the Second World War. They slowed down the German attack significantly and bogged the Germans down. Now, would NATO be better than that? I don't know. It's tough to get supplies into that zone. It's much tougher than it was in Iraq, which is an open space with lots of sea access. This does not have lots of sea access, and it is not open, flat space. So you have to build it up in strange neighboring countries like Albania or Bulgaria, or, and then that violates those countries' interests. They don't really want a war staged on their neighbors with their own ethnic difficulties from their territories. So there are lots of complications, and I think there's one added complication about a land war. If I'm not mistaken, next year is an election year in this country. I believe a certain vice president is running. Last time a Democratic vice president ran during a war with body bags coming home from a war zone, he lost. That was Hubert Humphrey. So would Mr. Gore, much as he's been a cheerleader for the war, would he want to be running an election campaign in the middle of a difficult ground war in which there would be casualties? Maybe, on the other hand, we can get the Poles and the Czechs to do all the fighting, or the Hungarians for us. I doubt that, by the way. Hungary has its own concerns about Serbia. There are ethnic Hungarians living in Serbia who they are worried about. So, there would be all kinds of dealings as to who's going to go in, who's going to be in the land force, and how many Americans would be in it, but it would be very messy. Yes? Did you hear the question? The question is NATO in it for strictly humanitarian reasons or other reasons? I would have to argue no major power acts strictly for humanitarian reasons. There are humanitarian reasons, but I would also say that there are subtle and there are reasons in the minds of NATO decision makers, particularly in Washington, I think that we can gain friends and relations in this part of the world. That we can gain access to markets and commerce and trade and relationships with people in this part of the world, spreading American influence, power, and friendships, whatever that means. It means power, okay? It means power. We can gain influence in that part of the world at the expense of traditional forces. I think that Mrs. Albright thinks of Eastern Europe as an area to be liberated. Others in the American government may think this way. So it works together. Democracy is good. Humanitarianism is good. Trade is good, but so is American presence and American allies. They are now more willing to expand NATO further and are open to the petitions of further Eastern European countries. And the Russians see this as encroachment ever further toward them. You're right to point out, there are resources. There is oil. The further east you go, American companies are dealing for oil rights in former Soviet territories, much to the anger of the Soviets. By the way, we are seen as having a double standard. Is Serbia the only country in the world that is persecuting a minority? Can you name one in that same part of the world that has been very strongly attacking its own rebels from a different ethnic group that the Americans are backing the government? Yes. Turkey. Turkey is seen as an example in that part of the world of American double standard. They are very vehemently attacking their Kurdish uprising, which they don't recognize. They don't recognize the Kurds as a separate people. Just as the Serbs are reluctant to recognize the Kosovars as a separate people. Their tactics have been quite heavy-handed to chase and attack and repress the Kurdish uprising. They're getting billions of US dollars of military assistance in that campaign. Why? Why?